Arts Center's three-part webinar series, Finding Focus in Times of Crisis. This is a three-part webinar series on art and trauma. I am Sarah Solfa. I'm PPAC's founding CEO and artistic director. For those of you who may be tuning in by audio and unable to see us on video, I wanted to describe myself for you all. I'm a middle-aged white woman with gray roots and long, dark hair. I'm wearing a black sleeveless blouse and I have large tattoos of roses on my shoulders. I'm so grateful for our community and our ability to stand together through all the multiple crises that we are living through at this time. I want to thank Denise Lim for reaching out to PPAC with a genuine desire to help when Philadelphia went to shelter in place. I want to thank PPAC's team for their dedication to our work and mission while being nimble and able to pivot during our changing time. I especially want to thank Lori Wazelchuk, PPAC's Exhibition and Programs Coordinator, for her work on this program today. And I am extremely grateful and thankful for our panelists joining today. Thank you, Denise, Yasmine Awais, and Dr. David Herman Jr. for your hard and thoughtful work for this webinar series. I want to invite all of you to stay connected to PPAC. Check out our website to see all our other online programs, online classes, as well as resources and opportunity for artists. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Denise, who will lead us through today's webinar.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. My name is Denise Lim, and I've had the great pleasure to work with the Philadelphia Photo Arts Center to plan and organize this event. This three-part webinar series called Finding Focus in Times of Crisis. I just wanted to alert everyone to a couple different things. We're currently recording this webinar and streaming live on YouTube. And as we would like to create as inclusive and accessible a virtual space as possible, I also wanted to alert you all that once the video is posted, we will provide closed captioning at the end of the session for the video portion. And this is for the convenience of those who might need or prefer to follow our discussions today with the provision of English language subtitles. These should be made available to you on the PPAC website where you registered for this first session's event. We've also asked that our speakers today would just be mindful to identify themselves when they first speak, to describe what they look like, and to also describe any visual material that we might want to share with you today for those who are calling in using audio only. Hopefully all of these things will be available to you no later than Saturday, but we'll be sure to keep you all updated. Also, given the size of our audience, we've just asked that everyone stay mute on their speakers and to encourage you to use the chat room function. We will allot at least 15 to 30 minutes at the end of our discussion for question and answer. So feel free to submit your questions to everyone. Lori will be kindly monitoring the chat screen to keep track of which questions you all want to pose to the speakers as we proceed. And as this is the first time we've ever organized this webinar, we do really love to get your feedback. So feel free to respond to anything we're talking about as we go along, and we'll be sure to kind of keep track of all of those things. So before we begin, I'd actually like to open this session today with a land acknowledgement. For those of you who might not be familiar, a land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects the indigenous peoples who were the original stewards of the land that we currently occupy. As I speak to you today from Wynwood, Pennsylvania, roughly 9 miles from where the Philadelphia Photo Arts Center is situated, I openly recognize the Lenape Indian tribe as the original inhabitants of Eastern Pennsylvania. We acknowledge the Lenape people as the indigenous stewards of their homelands and as the spiritual keepers of the Lenape Sipu, what some now know to be the Delaware River, and do hereby commit to actively supporting our Lenape sisters and brothers in whatever way we are able, and by helping to preserve and maintain both the cultural identity and heritage of Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, and Southern New York. Since our activities are shared digitally on the internet, I realize our other speakers and audience members may be tuning in from diverse locations. I would like to request that we all just take a moment to consider the legacies of colonization, genocide, land theft, and state-sanctioned violence that both Indigenous communities and people of color in the United States have been forced to endure. I ask that we continue to reflect upon a few key questions. Who gets to belong to the communities in which we reside? What people and communities are seen as valuable or legible? What communities are seen as disposable or negligible? As we think about how to fight for and support our Indigenous, Brown, and Black communities, I invite you to join us in acknowledging that we have a shared responsibility to make good of the time and space we create here today, and for each of us to consider our own social role in efforts of collective decolonization, reconciliation, and solidarity. Again, my name is Denise, and I identify as a Chinese American woman with cultural heritage ties to Hong Kong, the Philippines, and Canada. I have warm tone beige skin with olive undertones, shoulder length black hair, and I'm speaking to you from my sister's dining room table in her home in Wynwood, Pennsylvania. Behind me, you'll see that there are two really lovely oil paintings that were done by three of my cousin's children when they were the ages of 5, 6, and 7. They collaborated together to create this series of paintings. So the two that you see behind me are meant to embody summer and autumn. The painting to my left has splashes of mostly mustard yellow paint with forest green, red, and black. The other painting to my right is mostly a deep green color with splashes of yellow, gray, white, and peach. I am a recent PhD graduate in sociology from Yale University and also hold a master's degree in African studies. I'm currently a sociology lecturer in Yale College and will be teaching a course this fall semester entitled Space, Time, and the African City. I have over 14 years of experience teaching, writing, and curating African-related scholarship for both academic and general audiences. As someone very passionate about the relationship between the creative arts and cultural sociology, I was motivated to organize this event as a means of educating others on different ways we can reimagine art and its role in our society today. So I'm very excited to have joining us today two speakers and colleagues whom I feel will offer us really rich and meaningful perspectives on some of the questions that we want to explore with you today. We have Yasmine Awais, who is a licensed creative arts therapist and professional counselor who found her way to art therapy through engaging in photographic dialogues with incarcerated individuals. Yasmine was formerly Associate Clinical Professor in the Creative Arts Therapies Department at Drexel University and is a PhD candidate in social welfare at the Graduate Center, City University of New York, where she is also a Presidential Research Fellow. She serves as the board president of Artistic Noise, an arts-based organization in Harlem that works with youth involved in the justice system. Her research interests center diversity in the creative arts therapies and in higher education. Yasmine is also happy to announce that Foundations for Art Therapy Supervision, a text that she co-authored, is now available for pre-order through Routledge. We also have Dr. David Herman Jr., who is an assistant professor of art education at the Tyler School of Art and Architecture at Temple University. He is a lens-based artist, educator, and scholar whose work explores the relations between the perceptual and the social as a politics of ontology. He is the co-founder of Preservation Link, an arts education nonprofit dedicated to creating visual literacy curricula for communities who have been historically underrepresented. He also currently serves as an executive board member of the International Visual Sociology Association, an advisory committee member for Brandywine Workshop and Archives Digital Portal Project, and Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Commission member for the National Art Education Association. So I just want to thank both Yasmine and David for joining us today. I'll be kicking us off with some of our discussion questions, but before I do so, I just wanted to ask both David and Yasmine to go ahead and identify themselves.
Yasmine, please.
Okay. Thank you, David, and thank you for the introduction, Denise. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so I am an ambiguously brown person. I have brown skin and am multi-ethnic South Asian by way of Pakistan and Southeast Asian by way of the Philippines, both countries with long histories of colonization. I am also ethnically Chinese. My multi-ethnic identity makes it difficult for people to place me. In the United States, I am often not seen as Asian or even as a person of color. I am not seen as white. I am simply often not seen. My hair is cut short and is black with a sprout of white. Behind me is a large watercolor that features red and is in partial view. Also in view is part of a tall white bookshelf and part of the gray couch that I am sitting on. I'm tuning in from the South Bronx, which has a complicated history with land, redlining, economics, poor health outcomes, and pollution.
Hello, everyone. My name is David Herman Jr. I'm going to keep this simple. I'm a Black man that's about 5'9½", born and raised in South Carolina, and I'm sitting here now in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in my studio just about 5 blocks west of Temple University's main campus. I'd also like to acknowledge my Gullah Geechee roots and the African ancestors that were stolen away from the motherland and brought to various places, but particularly the place that I call home, Georgetown, South Carolina. I'll leave it there.
Thank you both for those introductions. And I think just to let our audience know, our intention in organizing this event was really to try to explore the role that creativity in the arts play as it's broadly defined. And especially now during these multiple crises that have emerged. Not only is the world facing this massive pandemic, but there have been multiple social crises such as Black Lives Matter. And this sort of got us all thinking about ways that we define crisis or trauma, even the ways that we think about art and how we define that. So I thought we could start our discussion today with sort of defining all our different terms, right? We named our series Finding Focus in Times of Crisis. And this first session, we wanted to name Being Imaginative is Essential. So I thought I could turn to David and Yasmine to kind of think about this first question of how do you define crisis? And what crisis are you personally confronting right now?
Yeah, so for me, Denise, crisis is always situated in the body. So in terms of any definition, I have to consider that kind of presence. And it's this sort of asymmetry, or maybe a kind of being away from a familiar or place of home. So when we think about crises, or when I think about crises, I am thinking about a sort of unsettlement from a familiar place that is often shrouded in some type of anxiety or some type of uncertainty or fear that causes the body to feel it and for it to be present and present itself in a myriad of ways. For me right now, that's a really loaded question in terms of what does crises mean for me? I mean, it's very pluralist, not just because of COVID or, and not just because of the civil unrest that we are seeing in the US or even in the world, but also, you know, this is the year of an election, and that we can clearly understand, at least visually, what's possible or what's unseen and what's happening in the world, in media, in real life, in personal stories. So yeah, I mean, for me, the crisis is finding a center and staying centered in how I respond to all of these different crises that's going on right now.
Right. Yeah, I agree with so much of what David is saying, particularly how it's housed in our body, and that our physiological reaction alerts us to the fact that there is a crisis, when sometimes for some people, it might be easier to ignore. When we've been talking earlier about this idea of crisis, I thought a lot about crisis being something that you can't ignore, that's ever present. And when you try to ignore it, whether it be in your body or elsewhere outside, it's just something that keeps coming into play, maybe in our dreams, it's just everywhere. But then as I was thinking again, when you posed the question, Denise, I was reminded of one of my first clinical jobs. And there we were told that crisis means opportunity plus danger. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about in this time, because if it wasn't for COVID, Black Lives Matter, we know, has been happening pre-COVID. But if it wasn't for COVID, I'm not sure how much attention the larger population would be paying attention to it, and the election. And it brought us together. And it's bringing everybody else together. So I think the way we can take advantage of this crisis is by seeing it as an opportunity and making change. It will just be a disaster if we don't take it as an opportunity to do anything.
Yeah, I appreciate that definition of opportunity plus danger. I was also kind of considering last night, how would I define crisis? And I was an English major before, so I'm a little bit of a nerd about looking up the history of words and where they come from. So I was reading the etymology of crisis, and I thought it was very interesting that it actually has medical roots in its connotation. So it actually referred to this turning point in a disease, which I think is so fitting for our time. And that change can indicate either recovery or death, so that there's this sense of like a crossroads, right? And I thought it was interesting to think about crisis as a decisive point where you kind of have to calculate or reevaluate sort of the meaning of something. And I think that's where that connection to trauma might come in. There's obviously clinical definitions of trauma. As a sociologist, we think about collective or cultural trauma, how a sense of a collective identity can be disrupted by certain events. And there's so many different ways, right, that we could trace that type of trauma when it comes to rethinking what is meant by Black Lives Matter, or what we imagine is meant by racialized trauma. You know, when I think about what I'm facing personally, it's both individual and collective, right? There's such an intertwined relationship where we're very shaped by the societies we come from, but we each have different ways that we kind of travel and move, whether virtually or not. But when I think about my own identity, you know, my parents migrated to the United States, and I have a very rich kind of history and heritage that even being called Chinese, for example, is not monolithic, it's not unitary. There's a very rich diaspora. Both my parents come from countries that were formerly colonized, and also very tuned in to what's happening in the West. And the idea that these sort of social justice movements aren't contained just in one place, because our world has changed so much. So I thought firstly about like existential crisis, kind of this reevaluation of what's the meaning of our own life. But also, yeah, on this collective scale, right, where we had to ask ourselves, how are we going to respond to what's happening around us? And are we going to take action? Are we going to take responsibility in some way, or acknowledge a lot of these things?
Yeah, I want to say, the opportunity that you mentioned, Yasmine, and the turning point that you mentioned, Denise, in terms of responding, and that question, it becomes, for me, it becomes an issue of willingness. You know, like in your responses, it's also, what is also couched is, what am I willing to do? And more than that, what am I willing to do with my physicality? What am I willing to do with my body in these turning points of this time of crisis, in order to affect a more positive change? At least in that direction is what I'm thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess what are ways that you both imagine is a call to action for you both personally? I mean, Yasmine, I know you're an art therapist, and David, you both work in the realm of sort of lens-based photography and arts, but you're also an educator. I think you both have such rich experiences. How do you kind of imagine action and response at this time?
Well, I think, understanding that action there's multiple ways of action, and that we have to engage in as many ways as possible. At least for me, I feel like if I think of it only in one way, like for example, if I think about it in terms of my art therapy identity and only thinking about how can I work with other people, for me, that's very narrow. I think about it on multiple levels, similarly as to what you were saying before, Denise, in terms of individually and collectively. I think part of action is taking a really deep look at myself. So as an Asian American, how have I benefited from the oppression of my Black brothers and sisters? How has that helped me and my family? And of course, how has that also hurt me and my family? And how much of my own pain has been surrounded by that, because it hasn't really been discussed. So there's this inner work, but then there's also, when we think of concentric circles, like then how am I interacting with my partner and close friends? How am I interacting with my family? How am I interacting with those around me? And thinking about and of course, with other movements, largely protest, how am I engaging in all of those different levels? So I think of those types of interactions, and then also in terms of my work, right? What is my scholarship like? Is my scholarship matching my values? Is my scholarship lifting up the movements that I say are important? So really thinking about all of these different aspects, even the food that I eat, just everything. So really being more conscious, and also understanding that it's just a lifelong ongoing endeavor.
For me, Denise, action and responsibility. I think individual and collective is really important. I tend to lean towards the individual first, and being self-interested, which is different from being selfish or anything in that negative tone. But for me, being self-interested goes back to the willingness and the responsibility. Just in terms of, again, where am I willing to place my body, and how am I willing to feel my body not at home or being unfamiliar? And this becomes really important in the context, I suppose in the context of COVID and in the context of Black Lives Matter. And COVID in terms of wearing a mask, or social distancing, Like, am I willing to do that for myself and my family and my friends? And then collectively, am I being responsible to the collective? And then when you think about issues of equity and inclusion, or Black Lives Matter and the things that we're confronting right now around civil unrest, it becomes self-interestedness in the way of, again, what am I willing to do? What is my responsibility? So for instance, the whole idea of allyship, right?
Yeah.
I am tending to think that what I'm hearing is that you are an ally for me, but the reality is I could be an ally for you, because this issue that we're dealing with is not a problem that I created. So if we're about to do, and I'm going back to your term of crisis and this turning point, then this is more your turning point, because there's a certain unveil or realization that's being had that I have lived 40 plus years with, you know? So I'll be your ally, and we should talk about what that means. Because one of the things that means for me personally is that ally, I mean, that individual being able to, willing to listen, willing to relinquish power within its structures, and maybe even going on a joyride and sitting in the back seat and letting somebody else drive. And that's not, I'm finding that that's not easy, because structural, organized systems of power are entrenched in our daily lives, daily thinking.
Yeah. I so appreciate you bringing that up, David, because I also have thought a lot lately about what it means to be allies. And I think partly why I kind of fell in love with sociology is that this discipline for me when I first went to college was revealing something that I thought was otherwise sort of common sense, but we're not always encouraged to think too deeply or critically. And it wasn't until I kind of went to Bryn Mawr, a liberal arts college, that sort of forced me to take subjects that I never even knew existed, that I was really looking around Philadelphia and asking these questions of, why do I see such a huge social class difference? Or why does there seem to be these divides by this idea of what race is? And race obviously being deeper than the literal physical difference in, say, skin color, right? That the more we are open and curious to learn, we realize that this notion that someone is other or inferior or beneath is definitely socially constructed, right? It has these deeper, longer histories that go beyond just an individual's opinion. It's part of what you were saying, like this larger social structure, right? And that's sort of what we're talking about when we talk about systemic racism, right? That it's not just what your body looks like, but how it is read by others. And to me, being an ally has to acknowledge the historic inequality and power between different groups, but also that willingness, like you said before, of changing that dynamic. And to me, that's kind of where the imagination part of our series title for today comes in. To me, being creative, imaginative is having the courage to think outside the norms. And in sociology, we use that word norm to talk about kind of behavioral rules, value judgments that are created in a given context, right? And I think some of the most productive conversations, things that we see in terms of creation of space or objects, comes out of this thing that I'm calling creativity or imagination. And some call that art, right? And we could talk later about what that means. But to me, these are all very linked concepts, because it's sort of this key to understanding, at least for me, what allyship means, where it's breaking beyond the boundaries of how we normally relate to one another, kind of acknowledging where there's that inequality, where there's stereotypes, where there's assumptions. And like you say, coming to the table, thinking of one another as collaborators, rather than something paternalistic, sort of one way help, you know, quote unquote, whatever help means. But being willing and open, I think, to engage with each other, to not be afraid to acknowledge what might feel unfamiliar, what might be sort of taboo to talk about, and actually come in admitting, you know, I don't actually know this experience that you might be having, but I'm willing to learn.
Yeah, I woke up this morning thinking about how do we cultivate a certain kind of spatial awareness in these times. Again, just how, going back to the imaginative, how do we begin to get uncent? How do we find ourselves anew in the middle of crisis? Mm-hmm. And part of that is you always ground yourself in what's habitual, what's normal, what's familiar. But then there's that unimaginable that I feel we're all in that zone, in that space right now. And to be imaginative requires that you are willing to let go of the unknowing, of the known, realizing that there's always this unknown and that you're in the middle of it. And that again, and I can't stress enough the idea of willingness, and that you are willing to take part in the unknown. And as I talked about the individual or self-interestedness earlier, but you know, now I'm stepping towards the collective, because the collective requires that kind of being in the world. That you understand that you know, and there are things that are visible and there are things that are not visible. And those things that are visible are still very present, even though they're not visible, they're present, and that they have an impact and an effect on how you are in the world and how you respond to the world and how you treat people. You know?
Wow, I am so much of just hearing you both speak about imagination is getting my mind like all excited. And I'm thinking back to how we came up with this name of being imaginative, as being essential, in terms of when we're thinking of when COVID first hit, and this concept of essential workers and who are essential, whose bodies are disposable, whose livelihoods are disposable, whose do we need to survive. And as we know, the arts have been getting cut all over the place. Of course, many large institutions have been getting lots of funding, and that's discussion for another webinar. Lots of other places have been suffering. And as we know, in the big institutions that have been getting lots of money, they've been cutting their art education staff. And so it's just interesting when we think about education and what gets cut, you know, arts, music, what gets cut, what's not essential, and what is really essential. And I think part of our argument and part of us talking today is saying that the arts are essential, because if it isn't for the arts, we can't imagine. We can't think about this idea of recovery or death, right? And that's why I think for some people, crisis is so scary. Because for some people, crisis might just be this unsettling, but not knowing that the real crisis, and I do love that medical definition or the history of crisis, is that it's the turning point and what is going to happen. And it requires imagination to think of what would death look like? What would recovery look like? What will my future look like? And that is why it's so important. The arts, creativity, imagination, I think all of that is so risky, sort of like crisis, because you have to be willing to not know what's going to happen. You know, if you're really engaged in the art process, are you willing to go there so much that you don't know what's going to come out on the other side? Are you willing to get messy? Are you willing to make mistakes? Are you willing to throw some stuff out? Are you willing to put the time in and then say, you know what, that wasn't good at all? And I think that's part of all of this stuff when we talk about what's at stake and putting the time in and all that, because you just have to be willing to do that.
I want to just make a quick comment based on what you just said, Yasmine, and then thinking about this whole idea of legibility. So speaking not necessarily with COVID, even though it might be, but I'm finding that communication skills is of interest to me. I mean, like it's a thing that I'm being made aware of more. Let me just say that. And what I mean is, and again, I'm laying this alongside structural power and legibility and voice. And we hear voice all the time, but I'm finding in myself to a great degree, but in others, that there are times when people want to say something, need to say something, but for some reason don't. And I think that the time now calls for someone to just speak. Like, just say what it is you need to say, the way you need to say it, and then it's up to somebody else to respond the way that they feel they're willing and ready to respond. But for you not to hold that in, because we are in significant times of transition. And it really does call that people speak up in the midst of power structures and not be afraid of it, you know?
Yeah. Well, I would like to add to what you said, David, because I completely agree with that. But when we're thinking of power structures, I think the people who want and need to say stuff, we need to prioritize Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in that sharing of voice. And that people need to give space for that, to be able to hear things. And because sometimes I hear people think that, well, I should give my opinion because my opinion matters, particularly white people. So I think in terms of, for some people, people who structurally have more power, to be able to understand that for some people, well, I think people who are structurally empowered need to take this time to listen and reflect. And it does not mean, I guess I just wanted to reiterate that, because I'm always hesitant when people hear that. They think, oh, well, I need to be more vocal. And I think some people need to actually not just hear and listen, and to ingest and to sit with discomfort. I don't know how that lands with you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's why I mentioned earlier about going for a joyride and finding the back. That's listening. Yeah. I mean, and again, I'll be an ally for you in this, in that journey, you know, of you listening to different voices that, for whatever reasons, have been challenged by power structures.
Yeah, I love this discussion around like actively listening and what it means to speak. Yeah, I was thinking a lot about how when there are times of crisis, like these turning points, another word that came up for me is reckoning, which has another word with roots in mathematics and accounting, right? You kind of add stuff up to check your math, right? But I'm sure we're all kind of familiar with that word in reference to the past, and especially really difficult or fraught past, you know, needing to reckon with it, needing to deal with it, needing to confront it. And I think part of the danger in times of crisis is that we try to avoid that kind of reckoning. We don't want to confront it. We don't want to actually grapple with the things that make it so difficult. And I think what we're talking about today is sort of recommending that we do and finding that courage to go ahead and engage, right? And to go back to something that Yasmine said about like why the arts is so important. On one hand, I think art is such a broad definition and concept, right? There's so many different ways to understand it. You know, institutionalized art has very specific meanings, right? Maybe we think of painting, sculpture, drawing, right? A certain type of formal object making. Whereas art can also be extended to other kind of mundane practices that may not be there for commercial sale, right? So like something that operates outside of a market. So not to say that there isn't inequalities that also exist within the things that we call art world, where artists participate in a certain way or there's a professionalization. But I think we're actually quite interested to encourage those of us joining us in our audience today to think about the ways that they create or imagine in their daily life, and ways that you can engage, even when we're sort of in this unprecedented circumstance where many of us are probably on lockdown or shelter in place, or that you feel a lot of risk even to go outside, you know, physically outside. And what are these ways that we kind of cope with the crises that we face? And to go back to that idea of reckoning, I think for me, one way that I've seen the arts really play a role in helping me process is that partly it's a mode of language, you know, using words or writing its language, but so is art broadly defined, whether that's visual. So sometimes working with material that I have at home, I really like to collage and choosing images that really speak to me. And there's something about this process of like cutting, selecting something, curating them, putting them together. And it means something to me, but it's not until I'm going through that process, maybe talking about it with someone, that I learn exactly what it means. Sometimes it inspires a memory, and then inspires a larger conversation. But to me, that's the ways in which I kind of imagine art and the role that it can play and why I think it is so essential. I don't know if David and Yasmine would agree with that, but at least for me, the reason I find it so meaningful is because I've been forced to stop, slow down, and really look, really ask myself a series of questions. And I'm kind of this sort of person where I won't let the question rest until I've really kind of looked into it, right? Like I do this research. I really want these kind of questions answered. And it, in a way, there's, it's good that it's not so definitive sometimes. It's really beautiful, I think, to see that there's so many different ways to answer these deeper questions.
Yeah, I feel, Denise, I feel like your last statement kind of jives with some of my work and interests in terms of spatiality, and time, and proximity, and this whole idea of like this whole idea of, for me, distance. So in other words, it's like you speak of the reckoning, and this kind of being able to reconcile, really, you know. So if we think about reconciliation, this is not a singular. We're never private. We may be personal, but we're never private. So if we're thinking about this from an environmental standpoint, I mean, we are always engaged and building our identity based on other things, right? I'm actually working on a piece now called Esculent Identities, just to speak to the visual and what we see as really like a presence. And so when I think about art and like art education or visual studies and the imaginative, it really becomes for me a matter of how does one understand how they are entangled with and producers with others and other things. I mean, we, you know, like you said, art can get manifested in more formal ways with material and you create a product. But inside of that manifestation, there is a presence and an action towards towards something else, towards something that you don't know. That, like you said, you always research until you kind of really settle into something, and knowing that that settling into something is still only partial because there's something that you just don't know. And we always know much less than there is to be known, you know? So art, you know, so I just want to say, like, specifically art, you know, for me as an art educator in higher education, I'm working with pre-service educators who are going to go into primarily spaces like schools, public schools and the like, but maybe museums, maybe community spaces, and just, you know, taking the model that we're, you know, the idea that we're talking about in terms of art and the imaginative, and thinking about how does that work in these current times when we're thinking about crisis, when we're thinking about COVID and isolation and distance learning, and how do you come together in a distant space, unlike being physical together, you know? And then also, it just really becomes a matter of like presence. It just becomes a matter of presence for me. I don't want to go too much in a tangent, but.
Well, the word that came up for me when I was hearing you both speak was intentionality. So how are we intentionally being imaginative in this moment? How are we intentionally carrying our bodies? How are we intentionally doing the things that we're doing? And I think that word came up for me, Denise, when you were talking about the act of collage, about curating and selecting and cutting. And for me, that makes me think a lot about photography. You know, how do we frame something? How do we look at a space? Photography isn't truth telling. It's actually a highly curated, selective way of saying, this is how I see the world, or this is how I want you to see what I see. And this idea of being very intentional in what we do. And David, when you were talking about being an art educator, or teaching future art educators, I was thinking of my role as an art therapist, but also as somebody who teaches future art therapists. And this idea of intentionality in terms of what are we bringing to the people that we work with. That the intention of I just want to do good or I just want to help people is not enough, right? You can't be getting into this because I want to save people. How are you intentionally thinking about doing this work? How do we intentionally choose the materials that we're using? with people? How are we the words that we speak, the jobs that we take, all of those different things are really vital. And also, you know, when we intentionally decide not to make artwork, you know, I'm thinking about my current state right now, and I'm heavily into writing, and I don't actually really like writing, right? But I'm in that process. I'm not making art, which is really what I want to be doing, but I'm being imaginative and creating in different process spaces. I guess that's also how I think about photography and also printmaking, like and ceramics, like very heavily in this process that you don't just make a mark and it's there. It like takes cultivation, it takes time, a lot of failure, thinking about growing things from seeds, baking, cooking, like things that really take a really long time and thought and process.
Yeah. You know, I'm glad you brought up the word intentionality in the way that you did. And I would also say, in terms of thinking about curriculum and thinking about learning and teaching, it's really important for us as educators to think, what are we looking to learn ourselves? And not just what are we looking to help other people learn, right? Because I think that shapes the task of learning and teaching in a different way, and maybe going against the grain that we're most familiar with, that might be something that holds up power structure. You know, I'm going to come in the classroom, I'm going to bring this full throttle or planned out syllabus, and this is what I might say we're going to learn. But most times it's like, these are the objectives for the class or the students. But I would say that, you know, we're all individuals in that space, sharing that space, learning and unlearning, and that it could be useful, especially in these times, to really think that what is it that I hope to learn from being engaged in this way, or this presentation that I'm putting in front of students. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. That's critical pedagogy, right? It's not a top-down method. It's how are we learning from each other? How are we co-creating the learning space? And I think of that a lot in terms of therapy too, right? If you're thinking of therapy as a top-down structure, which of course there are methods of that, if we think of conversion therapy, right? Which is not a therapy for those tuning in. But, you know, in thinking of therapy as a relationship, and you are building something together, rather than this therapist has all the answers or is all knowing and I don't know anything and that's why I'm going in. Those ideas are upheld because that keeps people in place, right? There are people who know, people who don't know. You must be sick or unwell if you're asking for help. So it keeps all those power structures in place. Whereas if we look at therapy or other ways of looking for knowledge through other people, collective learning, it totally changes our relationship to therapy, education, the arts, what have you.
Yeah. And then inside of all of that, you know, we have to contend with K through 12 indoctrinations that the students that come to us, we share space with, I should say, already pretty much understand that they're in an experience that the educator, the teacher, or professor, or facilitator is supposed to do X, Y, Z, and that's the kind of relationship. And it takes a little while to get students to realize we're doing something different here, you know?
Oh, yeah, and some don't ever get that. And I think it becomes really hard. And now I'm going off on a tangent. So Denise, you may just have to reel me back in terms of when you're a person of color teaching these types of methods to students who are coming from that education, right? So your evaluations are lower, you're criticized because you are not teaching the way that they are told that a teacher should be teaching. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that, because because of the structures that have, I mean, you know, being educated in the 80s, it was sort of the start of this, but anyone who was educated in the 90s or beyond, it was full on testing, full on a very specific way of being educated. And I think being educated in the 80s, it was like, it was not right there yet, because No Child Left Behind, all of that stuff was like just starting. But anyone else that we have taught within the last 10, 15 years has been deeply entrenched in, you are supposed to tell me what to do, what to think. And if you don't tell me, it doesn't mean you're not teaching me how to be a critical thinker. You just don't know how to teach. You're being lazy, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Denise.
Yeah, it's interesting. No. It's interesting though to think about, you know, the relationship of the arts or something creative and its potential for teaching and learning, right? And I think what we're picking apart is that, you know, even within the classroom context, there is there are pre-prescribed roles traditionally assigned to who we call teacher and student, right? Even though I think the three of us, when we are in that space, we tend to think of one another more as collaborators, right? Like that we each have something to contribute and to learn from one another. Even if I might have more formal training in a certain discipline or a certain topic, it's just one piece of the puzzle, right? And that, like, always what we know or learn can be enriched, right, and expanded upon. And I think this actually kind of leads really well into some of the questions that I see our audience has been submitting. There's been so many really rich questions, so I want to make sure we give enough time to answer. And thank you all again. You know, I know we asked that you all turn off your video as we're talking, just so that it helps us not be so distracted. But we do really appreciate all the engagement that I can see happening in the chat room. So we'll try our best to try to get through as many of these questions as we can. One participant asked, said, I'm curious to know if you all think there are contractions when we from the there are contractions from the individual to the collective level. What happens when the margins become the center?
Go for it, David.
What happens when the margins become the center? I think I was addressing some of that when I talked about the backseat, or when I talked about listening. You know, I mean, that is the willingness that has to take place. The margin does have to become the center. So the center is so the margins become clearly heard and understood, particularly if you know, people are using language like ally. Yeah.
I have nothing to add.
I don't know if I don't know if there's a problem with the terminology of margin and center. I think that we tend to construct our understanding of things in a pretty binary way. It's always this or that. It's either you're at the edge or you're at the center. But maybe what I feel like we've been trying to suggest in our conversation is that there's a different way to think about those configurations. I almost think like I want to promote more of a relational kind of understanding where we can acknowledge that, yes, there does exist a power structure where it tends to be margin center, but there is a way to relate to each other that doesn't have to depend or make us feel stuck or imprisoned by that structure. It's very difficult work to do. But my hope is that, you know, a virtual space like this one today, we are part of intentionally creating new space where we kind of experiment with what that could look like. What does it look like to give voice to these different issues, these different ideas, these different concepts? How do we together as a collective create something that goes against these power structures, you know, designed to sort of oppress or silence that voice, you know, and make that visible?
I know I said I had nothing to add, but of course I have something to add. If we're going back to the metaphor of, you know, the car and being in the back seat, it's you have a different perspective when you are in different seats of the car, right? You just have a different perspective. But if we're thinking of power, who is a person who usually has the keys, right? Is that person who normally has the keys willing to give that up to be able to see things from a different perspective? And I just saw in the chat that, like, yeah, language is so important. And we do talk about margins and center a lot. And I think about concentric circles, like if we're thinking of different metaphors for those therapists who are out there. I think of Tavistock groups and how they do the address power in these groups is setting up a concentric circle. So the people who typically have the least voice and least amount of power sitting in the center, and those circling around. And then you have a different perspective on witnessing and being and centering. It's just a really interesting way of working. And I'm not really doing it justice right now and talking about it. So if people are interested, you could look it up. But I was thinking about this idea of concentric circles and spirals as another way to think of things, as opposed to just margin and just center.
Yeah, we actually have another question here. Yeah, to kind of keep those ideas in place as we answer. In terms of finding focus, what would our panelists say to this matter of global focus that is embodied and collective as well? On toppling monuments, is it a distraction? Is it the work of the imagination? Or what might this more broadly represent?
Yasmine, do you want to take that?
Well, maybe you remember the exact name of this project, but I think it was 2 years ago in Philly, there was the Imagination Monument Project. Do you know what I'm talking about, David?
I do.
Yeah, oh, thank you, Monument Lab, yes. Yeah. And so what is so wonderful, and of course, again, all of these things that we're talking about is not new. People have been talking about these monuments for a very, very long time. Decolonize This Place is just one of the many groups who have been trying to take down the Columbus statue outside of the Natural Museum, Museum of Natural History. But and again, that's just one group. We know tons of groups have been doing this. But Monument Lab comes to mind because that was this idea of what can we imagine? And then a few years later, it's actually happening, which is just really incredible. And I don't think, it's not my place to say, is it too late? But I do think that it's part of that imagination that allowed us to even consider these things, to consider that monuments can move, because that's the whole point of a monument, right? The idea is that it never leaves. So it takes a different type of imagination for us to think about. A monument is just another thing.
Yeah, I hope I'm understanding the question right, but I'll just respond to how I'm perceiving it. And the thing that comes to mind most for me in terms of like the monuments from a global standpoint is that collectively, the frustration of being oppressed and marginalized and killed at the hands of structural organization reveals itself in how people are treating what's visible and what seems substantial and permanent, like you said, Yasmine. And for me, that means a great deal, especially putting it into a global perspective, because I mean, that sends us right back to colonialism and all the things that are associated with that term linearly until we're here now, you know, imperialism, whatever the term might be. But I think like it just speaks to how enormous and massive the concern of colonization is, and that we are literally at a pivotal point globally where people, going back to the margins, are saying something and they're doing something, right?
Yeah.
Well, what you just said, David, is that's why we're in a crisis, right? This is the action, or part of the action.
Yeah, and actually this next question I think is related to this. Would the panelists speak to the power of the arts and imagination as both a healing tool and social justice tool because of the art's ability to skip the quote unquote inner critic space in our brain?
Well,
just thinking about that question. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, no, go ahead, Denise.
Just thinking about this question in terms of the power of the arts and imagination, and related to what we were just saying about monuments. You know, I was thinking immediately of the Roads Must Fall movement, which started at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, where students tore down the Cecil Rhodes statue that's there. And Cecil Rhodes was a very famous sort of British colonizer, traveled extensively throughout Southern Africa. And this sort of also kind of sparked the Fees Must Fall student protests in South Africa. And then more recently, Oxford University also had their own kind of Roads Must Fall, taking down of those statues and monuments. So I was thinking a lot about what it means to call these movements global, because I think there's always sort of this way in which we see the globe as very, very interconnected, right? Each of these spaces do not exist in a vacuum. There's always constant exchange and interaction. And we're inspired by something that's happening elsewhere because it seems so present where we are, even if there seems to be physical or geographic distance. And so I think that's where this question then about the power of the arts and imagination comes in for me, especially when we want to think about that in relation to healing or social justice, that it may not always be used for this purpose, but it can be used for this purpose of imagining different or new ways of being an activist, bringing attention and visibility to something, again, that has been erased or silenced or put at the margins, right? So again, this notion of like, how do we create space where we are not always marginalizing something, right? That how do we then create a means to grapple with the difficult material? So something like the creation of a monument, I don't necessarily have anything against taking them down, because obviously the reason it had the power it did is important to track, understanding that history, and then understanding what it means to respond to it by wanting to destroy it. What is it that we want to destroy? Because we're always still making something, even in our destruction, right? That the absence of something can still be the presence of something else. And I think that's where it's so rich to have this more broad kind of understanding of the arts, that whether you're a professional artist or not, you can always be creating and making and applying your imagination in these really productive ways.
Well, what I wanted to respond to was this idea of the arts being, and I know the person who raised this question didn't explicitly say this, but I think sometimes we run into a position where we think the arts fixes everything, and it doesn't. There are literally art critics, right? We could say there's our inner critic, right? But there are people whose profession are literally art critics. We know the arts have been used for propaganda, are currently being used for propaganda. If we're talking about monuments, and I mean, we could have an argument about, are monuments art or are they not art? Are they art with a capital A, little a, whatever? But if for a second we pretend that monuments are art, then we can say that they are harmful, that they are not neutral or they are not beneficial. I think part of what we're arguing is to make the arts use as a way, as a tool for healing, as a way to engage in social justice, to engage people in conversation. But I think we have to be very cautious when we say the arts can fix everything, because they can't in and of themselves. The only way art works is if we're in conversation with each other, if we're in dialogue. You know, what's interesting about thinking about monuments, I'm thinking to back in the day when Maya Angelou got her monument selected for the Vietnam Memorial. And that was not seen as a good thing, right? Like first, the design was accepted, but then when they found out who she was and what her body looked like, then all of a sudden it wasn't okay. So monuments, art making it being inherently therapeutic or good or all that stuff, we have to really question that. And yes, the arts can be used for social justice if we think about intentionality and all of those other things we discussed.
Just 2 quick points. Denise, when I listen to you, about the monuments, I think about placement and context. So, you know, whether it's placed very visible or it's destroyed or it's rolled into the bottom of a harbor, or if it's put in a contextual space like a museum or whatever, it really becomes placement. And then the second, not necessarily point, but the second thing, Yasmine, my question becomes a figurative question. What does it mean to heal? And how is that an individual and collective thing, right? I would imagine it's a little bit of both, but I imagine if I'm answering that question, what does it mean for me to heal or to feel as though I'm healing? I have to address individually a lot of varied things. That's always contextual and collective, right?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question around healing, because our next question, I think we can think about it in relationship to that. You know, someone asked, how do you see shame as playing a part in the current crisis, and how can the arts play a part in mitigating shame?
Wow.
And I think it's such a loaded word, right? Like shame, healing, the role of arts, but yeah.
Yeah.
Shame and fragility.
That's exactly where
Yeah.
I'm like, I don't know if I can go there. Please, Dave.
That's a really great question.
Yeah.
And I would say, if one is thinking about shame, then they might want to consider how they're implicated directly or indirectly in whatever might be making them feel shame. And then addressing that head on, honestly, and again, be willing to deal with issues of fragility because I do think that those words are very connected, very tethered, and again, you know, going back to people of color and culture and indigenous people, I think it's safe to say we can be allies. We could be places of allies for that, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I really apologize to whoever raised that question or people who are grappling with this. I did not mean to laugh at shame. I think my response to laughing was how, you know, Dave and I, we never met in person, and I never met Denise, but how much in sync and how connected I feel to both of you, because my response, my laughter was also part of maybe part of frustration, in that that it is really hard to hear that. It's difficult to hear that, because for me also, the first thing that came to my mind was fragility. And I was thinking, that's a difficult question to answer in the webinar format. Whereas if that was a question raised to me in the therapy format, I may say something like, I would love for you to draw your shame. I would like you to embody your shame. I want you to talk to your shame. Nice. But me, in the body that I am in, the weight that I hold, the, you know, the legacy that I carry, like from my ancestors and from my family, I cannot tell people what to do with their shame, but I can help you explore it. So again, I truly want to apologize, because I do not mean to laugh at anybody's shame or anybody's feelings. It was really coming from this place of how hard this work is. And even for me, you know, as a professional, hearing that, what that brings up for me. And when I hear about things like white fragility being like a bestseller and all of that kind of stuff, again, it makes me feel of whose voices get lifted during times of crisis.
Yeah, and yeah, Yasmine, I think when I also joined in the laughter, it's not to laugh at this idea of shame or that we feel it, but that I think we all agree, like, that's such a difficult question. We obviously don't have the time to like fully explore that here, but I'm so grateful that it was raised. Because I was also thinking about how, as someone who has participated in art therapy, I really appreciate being asked, like, how would you draw or visualize shame if you're feeling that? And I've also been asked to kind of talk through, why did you represent it in this format, right? So if we go back to, like, say, the collaging exercise, I might spend several hours like looking at different things and thinking about, why am I so drawn to this particular image? And it's not until I start to undergo that process of making and imagining that I start to unearth, even within me, what shame even means. Where did that come from? Is some of that rooted in my sort of societal context, my personal family history? Did it remind me of a specific experience? And that's where I think this active imagination or the arts can help us engage and explore in a hopefully safe way. You know, again, it always kind of depends on your orientation in terms of the way you want to engage with something. But I do think it can be this really productive space when you're willing to be a little brave, right? To ask yourself those tough questions and be honest, I think, honest with yourself about what these things mean in relationship, not just to yourself, but to your greater society.
Yeah.
Honestly,
I'm sorry. Honesty is imperative. And I feel like that question was a really honest question, and a really important, critically important question in terms of the things that we've been talking about, particularly from the beginning, speaking on crisis and what that means in terms of 2020, you know?
Mhm.
Yes, and I was going to reiterate the same thing. I'm so glad that came up, because my tendency is not to want to address that. And I think by us, even for a few moments, grappling with this is so important. And for all of us to look at, what does shame look like and how it is different for each of us, and how our response is. Like, if you also laughed, what does that mean? If you were upset by hearing laughter, what does that mean? Because we are all interconnected. So I really thank the person who raised that question. It's vital. Thank you.
I agree. And if you think about it, like, put it in the context of any and everybody, what do you do with shame?
Mm-hmm.
You push it aside, you
Yep.
put it in the closet, you posture in ways that always kind of lets that be marginal for various reasons. But to let what might be even perceived as shame come to the surface, then you're able to deal with, and let me take that word back, you're able to respond to things in a more honest way that might get you further down the road.
Indeed. And
Yeah.
that's with this idea of, like, if you were to make your shame, right, or draw your shame or respond to your shame, that also puts it to light. Because when we hide things, I mean, I guess that's a big part of shame, right? Not wanting to see something, not wanting to see the dark side, not wanting to see the shadow, then it never will go away. You know, it's just temporary, or it might temporarily go away. So by actually physically creating something and saying, this is my shame, and then doing whatever you want with that, itself can be transformative and powerful.
Yeah. I saw something on TV just yesterday, briefly, so forgive me if I try not to look at too much TV, but it had something to do with reparations in Asheville, North Carolina. And a reporter was moving around asking people in the streets about this. And I was just struck because there were 3 white men, older white men, that pretty much made the comment that, you know, slavery and things of that nature has nothing to do with them, that happened in the past. And that, so they were against reparations. And I'm just thinking about this whole idea of shame and stowing that away. It's like, you can be shameful of something that you are not directly, or were not directly involved with. But the thing that's important is that thing that happened lingered, and it's being very effective on people's lives still, in education and government and law and XY, and, you know, all of these things. So if somebody is feeling, in the context of Black Lives Matter and race, right? If somebody is feeling shame right now, I almost think like that's a really good thing to feel, because then you can start to query where the history, like you said, Denise, you like to follow the history. You could, then that might lead you on a search to really find out where that shame is, and how it, and why are you embodying that right now, you know? Anyway.
Yeah, and I want to be mindful of time, because I know, you know, but we only have a couple more minutes, but maybe just to close, I want to get to one more question. I know many of you have submitted more, and we'll keep note of this, so hopefully we can address this in some of our other subsequent webinars. But kind of the last question for today is, can you all talk about how you get clients or students engaged in authentic engagement? How might you assign art without assuming the role of power? And what methods do you use to radically differentiate between these? Oh, David, I think you're muted. Oh.
I said I missed the first part of that question, Denise.
Could you all talk about how you get clients and students engaged in authentic engagement? How might you assign art without assuming the role of power? And what methods do you use to radically differentiate between these?
Yeah, so I think just in brief, because of time, I was alluding to that earlier when I talked about learning and teaching. So for me, thinking about any engagement, I am always thinking about what might I be able to learn from the experience, shared experience, and how is it set up? How do I encourage my learning from my students? Like, how is it set up so I am clear with my intentions and how I communicate that to students first day of class, that this is what this semester could look like. And this is how I want to encourage all of our voices to emerge and collectively participate in whatever experience we have in this time together, you know? Just being clear about that communication and intention.
For me, it's really hard to force authenticity. So I think allowing people, whether it's clients or students, to be defensive if they need to, meaning if they need to draw or make the way that they typically draw or make, like David said earlier, we do what's familiar first before doing something that's imaginative. So I think by us thinking that a student or a client immediately is going to be willing to put it all out there and take risks and be imaginative is false, because we don't do that either, right? We like what's comfortable. So I think allowing people to struggle in that, to be witness to that, and then I think authenticity happens. Of course, I try to use little tricks, which may or may not work. Sometimes asking people to use their non-dominant hand, drawing with a 6-foot stick, making people like those little, and they are tricks, right? These are just little things that kind of get you out of how we normally operate. Drawing with your eyes closed, contour drawings, using found objects, like telling people not to use real art materials. I think anything like that can sometimes shift us into getting into a different space.
And authenticity means self-discovery. So if you can see in yourself and your students a kind of moving from a familiar to an unknown to a realization, then you can at least see what that might look like, right?
Yeah. Oh, one other quick thing that I wanted to say in terms of authenticity is also making art with clients and students. Goes back to what David was saying in terms of the power dynamic. I think if we think of very old school Freudian therapy, it's this idea of you don't even see the therapist and they're this quote unquote blank slate. And I think this idea of you are fully engaged, it is a relationship. I am going to make art alongside you is a way, another way to possibly get to the authentic.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, my experience as a teacher, usually that first class is really key in setting the tone, because you do have the power to set those normative kind of expectations, right? And I always like to start off a class with saying, when we engage in conversation, I'd really like it if we all learned each other's names, refer to one another by name and really learn, and to practice active listening, right? So that means you can repeat back what someone just said, right? Which sounds simple, but it's harder to do than we realize because we actually don't listen that well. And it's a skill that we really have to learn how to develop. But when we do learn how to do that, I think that's where the engagement happens. So when it comes to that question of like trying to foster something that we call authentic, I like the word genuineness, because I always make sure to check myself before I walk into the classroom that I'm also genuine, and that I start from a space of being genuine, because I think people can read what your intention is in that class time. Acknowledging that, yes, I have this particular role that I play that's called teacher, but being able to say to each of the students, you know, actually, this is a collaborative process. So I might know certain things, but you have to be reminded that you also know and have something to contribute, and that we don't always know what's going to happen within this session time. Or if you're creating it like an object together, it's the same thing. You don't really know ahead of time how it's going to turn out. So again, it's not comprehensive, but I think we're just trying to offer sort of different ways that I think in our own practice, we try to encourage that kind of environment, right? Well, thank you all for joining us today. It's been really, it's been a really amazing experience. I really have appreciated all those who came out to support us, to join this webinar. I just wanted to remind everyone that we do still have 2 more webinar sessions coming up. Our second session, Making Meaning Through the Creative Arts Process, will be on August 21st, Friday, the same time slot from 12 to 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And Yasmine will actually be leading that discussion. So I just want to turn it over to her to share with you all what that event will be like.
Sure. Thank you, Denise. And thank you, David and PPAC, for this amazing time together. So our next webinar will be more participatory, where we will explore how art making can be a grounding act and help us find meaning amidst uncertainty. Art therapist Chloe Hayward and I invite you to submit a visual image or text response to the prompt, look around your environment and find an object to which you are drawn. Once you find this object, engage with it. If possible, pick it up, ask it a question, notice how it feels, photograph it, smell it, or make a piece of art about the object using whatever materials you have available to you. Submissions are done through the PPAC website, where you can register also for the webinar. Feel free to include a brief title and your name no later than the day before the webinar, August 20th at 12 p.m.
Great, thank you. Sorry, Sarah, did you want to?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. It was to all the participants, the panelists, and the participants on the call. Thank you so much for your thoughtful comments and questions. And I hope everyone remains well. And I look forward to seeing everybody again next month.
Great.